Brandi Badgett, it's great to have you here again. Today, on the second episode of our mini series, today we're going to be talking about backstory. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Brandi Badgett is a Fictionary editor and instructor at Fictionary. She's also an author and writes under the name Leigh Romero. She's got a brand new book coming out August the 12th called Love and Development. I have read the arc and it was amazing, a really amazing book. So I highly recommend that you click the link that I'll have in the show notes and you can go check it out for yourself. It's a great book. And if you like gaming and you're a girl and you're interested in anything like that, this book is going to float your boat. All right, Brandi, you're here today to talk to us about backstory. So great to have you back. What do we need to know about backstory?
Yeah, thanks for having me back. So think about the idea that your characters and your world don't just pop out of nowhere. There's all of these things that have created it and made it into what it is today. This includes your character's history, their childhood, their relationships, trauma, their victories, their experiences. It also includes the history of your world, the mythology, the wars, the people, the society, the culture, the clothing, all of that, which we call world building in fantasy and science fiction and historical fiction. But it occurs in any story, even if that story is contemporary, because there are going to be things that are unique to your setting that aren't in anybody else's setting. So all of these things are your backstory. They're what creates the reasons for what's happening in the current story, in the current situation. One of the first things it does is it shows your character's motivations, why they're doing what they're doing, why they're behaving the way they're behaving, why they're making the choices that they're making in your story. It's the origin of their wounds or their flaws or whatever you want to call it. And it has created their current worldview. One of the things that backstory does is it creates depth in your world and in your characters' lives. I think we talked about this before, or I know some famous authors have, that iceberg theory where you only see the top, but there's all of this stuff that's below. That's what causes your iceberg to float up and be seen. And even if it doesn't make it on the page, it's still there. Without it, your characters will feel flat or cardboard or however you want to describe it. They'll be very one dimensional. One of the most useful concepts in character development is the connection between the wound, the belief, and behavior. The character arc is all about the character realizing what their wound is because we're usually blind to our wounds. They have to realize what that wound is and how their behavior is no longer working in this particular situation. Maybe previously their behavior was working, it was keeping them safe, but now it's no longer working. So they're forced to change. To explain this a little bit more clearly, the character has experienced a traumatic event in their past, which has left them with an emotional wound. And this wound leads them to a certain belief about the world. And then that belief causes them to create specific behaviors to protect themselves from any similar situations or from that happening ever again. So, for example, the protagonist's parents abandoned them when they were a child. They believe that people always leave eventually. So their external behavior is to keep themselves distant, to push people away before they can be hurt. So that's all their backstory. And that backstory shapes their character identity and who they are. In science fiction, fantasy, and historical fiction, backstory becomes the history of the world. It's the reason why these genres have higher word counts because of how important the backstory is to understanding these unique worlds and these unique situations. Say, like a fantasy kingdom, it may have a recent war just finished or maybe there's a fallen empire or a forgotten prophecy. Fantasy loves its prophecies. Maybe there's a betrayal of families or some ancient magic that's being rediscovered. So the backstory informs why the people dress the way they do, the architecture, why the kingdom is located where it is. if it's a fishing village or a kingdom that's up on a hill because they used that hill for sacrifices previously, or the hill was a fort that became the kingdom because it had a very good defensible position. So all of these things, think about our own history that explain why and how these societies formed. That can help you to think of reasons why your society formed where it is. And some of the other things you also need to think about is who can do magic? Can everybody do magic? Can only certain people do magic? Can some people have stronger magic than other people? And how is that magic viewed? Is there good magic? Is there bad magic? All magic should have a cost, but does it have a cost according to the people and how they look at it? But backstory is also what the people eat. What kinds of things do they eat? If it's a kingdom that's close by a sea, then those people are going to eat more sea type foods. If it is a kingdom that is more landlocked or in a forest or something like that, they're going to eat different things. There might be certain ceremonies that are involved in that eating. I know in my fantasy, I have a specific food that is donated to the temple, and the temple uses it not just as a food, but they boil it first and they use the water as a dye to dye their clothing, which gives them a very specific color clothing for anybody who works and lives at the temple. These are all things that you need to think about when you're creating your world. Also, things like what do they use for money? In our world, we have bills and coins, but in the past, other things have been used like shells or hollow nut shells or little bits of particular stones or metals or whatever that have been found and turned into a certain thing. I know in some ancient cultures, they drilled holes through them and wore them as necklaces. So it was more than just showing off your wealth. It was like carrying it around with you and having access to it. So there's a lot that you can do with backstory and how you're building your world. In a sci fi, the world may have a lost colony, a previous ship disaster, a conflict between planets or alien life, some sort of new technology that has changed the way that people live or die. In Project Hail Mary, there's some new thing that has been discovered and it's causing suns to die all around the universe. So there's always something that, even though it may seem new, that's creating your current storyline, there's stuff that's built up from things that have happened before. And it's something that has happened over time, usually, and is not something that has just come out of nowhere.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Foundation. I don't know if you watched that series, but that had an extremely rich history, and that history impacted the future. So it was almost a cyclical thing. Well, it was cyclical, but with each cycle, there was progression. And the recursiveness of it was particularly interesting to me because you had all these other external prophecies and things going on as well. But the foundation of Foundation really was exactly as you're saying. It was how this whole entire system came to be and how it was going to collapse.
And so, depending on the story that you're telling, that adds so much depth to your story, to the purpose of why you're telling the story and what story you're telling. I just finished reading Brandon Sanderson's Way of Kings. And that also has that whole cyclical idea in it of things happening over and over again. Sometimes that is such an important part. It's basically the theme that you're hitting on. And so, in that case, the world building and the backstory become even more important to the story than just explaining moment to moment things. How all these things come about and what was sacrificed along the way. That's all important backstory that will inform the behaviors of the characters in the current story and how they are influenced or being influenced by them. That's why it's important to know all these things, even if it's not on the page. Because of the nature of historical fiction, there's a lot of research that needs to go into building the world accurately However, the history of the world as we know it only matters as it is seen through the lens of the people in the story and how it applies to the plot of the story. And this is true for all genres, but particularly for historical, because backstory only matters because it affects the present. That's the only reason why people are going to care about your backstory is because how it's affecting the characters and how it's affecting the present that they're living through. So, the biggest backstory mistake I think everybody is pretty much aware is the dreaded info dump. So remember that analogy of the iceberg? The author should know much more about the characters and the world than what appears on the page, like I said. So the reader doesn't need to know everything about everyone in your world, particularly at the beginning of the story. So this is how things should go in order. So first, for the reader, they need to empathize with your character. They need to care about the present, and then they'll start asking questions about them and the world in which they live. There should be enough backstory to create clarity about who the character is and what they are doing in the immediate moment, but the backstory should be dropped like clues, waiting to be uncovered by the reader as they continue the story, hooking them in by making them ask more questions instead of answering all of them. We can answer some of them, but it should, for the most part, be making them ask more questions. Too much backstory brings the story to a screeching halt. What you're doing is you start the story with your character, and then if you start dumping backstory in too long, what you're asking the reader to do is stop the story that they were reading and start reading about something that happened before. So think about when you meet someone new. You don't begin by asking them all about their history. Who were your ancestors and how did they get here and all of that? No, you ask them about right now, their present. And then once you find common ground with them, you begin to care about what has shaped them into the person that you know now. That's what you're trying to do with your characters. You want to hook the reader with who your character is now and what's happening to them right now. So that present creates interest, and then the past brings understanding about who that person is now. So, an example of this is in my book, Where Evil Resides. I have this character named Leon. And when Leon is introduced to the reader, they learn things about him, like he's pretty good at drawing and not so good at shooting. But he's a cop. He loves his job. So he's preparing himself to retake his firearms exam. These abilities have already been established in his past, so that's considered backstory. The reader is learning about them, but the character and the characters around him all know these things already about Leon. The reader learns two key skills that the character has. They learn his occupation and they learn about his dreams in this first scene. They can empathize and start rooting for him right away. They're like, hey, this guy really likes his job. He's not so good about shooting, but he really wants to be a cop. And so he's putting his all into this. So they have a reason to start rooting for him right away, to be like, I hope that he gets this and that he can continue being a cop like he wants to. So just enough backstory creates momentum. And the backstory does three things: it explains, it complicates, or it creates curiosity. So you want it to explain, to clarify who this person is, what's happening, what's going on, but no more. You don't want to over explain, just enough to explain what's happening. It complicates, meaning it creates some hooks and creates situations in which the character is making weird choices or choices that are maybe not necessarily the best for them, but it's because of their backstory. It's because of the things that have happened to them in the past, or it's because of the situation that has been created because of the past. Even a really good character with high intelligence and good charisma, if they're an intermediary in a war that has been caused by none of their doing, they're still going to have some serious issues being that intermediary. So the backstory is complicating their situation. And the curiosity is what keeps your reader reading. They want to know more. They want to know more about this character. They want to know more about this world. They want to know more. And a lot of that can come from hints from the backstory. You give just enough that they're like, ooh, what does that mean? And what created that? And why is that? And the more you get your reader asking questions, the more they'll be interested in reading your story.
Well, I'm going to refer to a book that you wrote, and you did that very well. You introduced us to your main character, and right from the get go, she was starting in a new school, but she wasn't feeling very good about it. And I didn't know why, but I wanted to know why. And you give this information. I don't want to give any spoilers, obviously, but you give this information out part by part. You breadcrumb it through the story when it's appropriate to bring it into the story because it's in her point of view. And that to me was a very satisfying way to get a person's backstory. You know, you're following their story in real time. And then this context is coming in at the appropriate times when the present story is demanding that and it makes sense. Only thing is the new information that you get makes you go, oh, wait, there's more I don't know. So I have to keep reading to find out more now. So that for me was a very recent experience of seeing how backstory was done well.
Thank you. I think that that's the most important thing when thinking about backstory is how if you dump it all at once in the very beginning, then why does the reader need to keep reading? They already know everything. They already know all of the history, all of the backstories. If you make it into a game, like I was saying earlier, like clues that are left, and like Elizabeth was saying, make it very appropriate to the situation, what is being learned, and what the character is doing at that point in time, and what their goals are at that point in time. We don't sit in the real world and ruminate on all of our history. I don't want to disparage any books or anything, but sometimes authors will use dialogue or they will use a specific character trait as an excuse to give backstory and large swaths of backstory. Some people can say that that's very unique and it's a new way to do it or whatever, but the reality is it's still an info dump. Some people like that. My husband is one of those people who love the old style fantasy books where the whole story, whole mythology of the world is a prologue. Some people love that. But in the current state of writing, in the modern reader who has a shorter attention span because of all of the technology we have and all of the choices we have, we don't have as much time to spend on backstory, world building, all of that stuff up front. So, the easiest way to get around that and still have that depth and that level of knowing and understanding about that world built in is to, as Elizabeth was saying, breadcrumb it in. And then your reader wants to know. Then they want more. They always want more. And that is what encourages them to continue reading, to enjoy the story, and to want more. They'll want a book two from you or a book three. They'll be asking for it instead of overwhelming them at first.
Do you have any tips that you could offer to writers that they could bear in mind as they're creating the story? Because at the beginning, when you were talking about the backstory can be the world, it almost felt like where does a person begin if they're starting a story? Some people start with, I want to write the story, and they see the story arc, and then they have to go build the world around it. But what about the people who actually start with the world first? What kind of tips can you give them so that they can not spend too much time world building and the story gets lost in the world building?
Yeah. So I did this when I wrote my fantasy. I got really interested in the world building part, and I spent quite a bit of time doing that. One of the reasons why I did was I was waiting to write the story in NaNoWriMo. I spent a lot of time world building and I was thinking about names of characters. I was thinking about names of places. I actually did the same thing when I was writing Where Evil Resides as well. I spent a really long time making lists of things and thinking about the world and how it works and making maps. I'm not a map maker at all. But I needed for myself, because I'm a very visual person, I made some rough maps. I tried using some software, which worked okay, but I think what I needed and what I think a lot of world building authors need is they need to be able to really see and understand their world before they can write the story. Because for me, if I don't know something when I'm writing my story, it's hard for me to just say, insert this thing here and move on. Because for me, everything is so interwoven and interconnected. But if I'm writing and I have a list of places, if I have a visible map, things like that, then I can just insert those things as I go and I can keep writing. Then when the revisions happen, that then I smooth all that stuff out. I do have some of that awkward stuff of on the right was this shop and on the left was that shop and they took a right on this street. And then how much of that is really needed in the final version of the story? A lot of it can be trimmed or smoothed out, but knowing that I'll be consistent because it's a series, knowing I'll be consistent in the writing of where everything is and what everything looks like and people's names and stuff like that really helps me not disappoint my readers.
Mhm, mm.
Once I have all of that set up, then it's set up for all of the books. Then when it comes time to write all of the books, I don't have to redo that. So I think for a series, it's a lot more important than maybe a singular book. When I wrote Love and Development, it was initially just a standalone. I didn't know what it was because it's not really like any of my other dark writing. I was like, I don't know what this thing is, but I really like this story and I'm going to write it. And it's cute. And I made up a few things. And then I had to go back and start thinking a lot more about those things and the people in that world in depth when I realized that it's going to become a series. So that one was a little bit more opposite, but it's in a contemporary world. So that makes it a little bit easier, even though I made up some of the places and some of the like the games and stuff are all made up from bits and pieces of other games that I've played.
So essentially, when it comes to world building, it's okay for a writer to be inspired by the idea of a world and not really have a story exactly in mind. They can just create that world and the story kind of rises up out of it.
I think it depends on the author, and I think it depends on the story as well. So for Where Evil Resides, I had an idea for a story first, and then I went back and did a bunch of the world building so that I could write that story and know where I was going with it. That was my first manuscript, and I didn't know how to write. I didn't know any of that, and I needed a lot more pieces to start with before I could start. For people who are pantsers or gardeners or whatever you want to call them, people who don't like to outline, they're going to need more pieces in the beginning. They're going to need more of the depth and the idea of what the world is like before they can start writing their story. Whereas people who are more outliners, people are architects or whatever you want to call them, they are going to need less of that, maybe, and the depth might come as they're writing. So it depends on the author, it depends on the story. I've had stories, like I was explaining, I've had some that go differently. Like, I had the story for Where Evil Resides first, and then I had to create the world before I started writing. With my fantasy series, I spent a long time thinking about the world and the magics and the races and the people and how all of that is concerned, because a lot of that was more about plotting and understanding the series story as a whole and what was going to happen over the course of the books before I started worrying about plotting the books in depth at all. For Loving Games, it was just a story that came to me. In fact, it kept annoying me while I was trying to write the first draft of my fantasy, and I had to take a break from my fantasy to write it because it wouldn't leave me alone. So that one, I wrote the story first, and then the idea that it was going to be a series, and so it needed more depth, that came after. I think for every author and for every story, it's going to be a little bit different. The one thing that you do want to be aware of is if you are somebody who gets way too caught up in the world building and you don't get anything written, then your story will never be told and your world will never be explored by other people. So you at some point have to start writing. Even if you're writing while you're world building or you don't know where the story's going. I mean, that's kind of how my fantasy came along too. So that one is going to be a while before it gets published because it's going to need a lot of work because that's how it happened. All of these things they're possible in all of us and you just kind of have to find your own balance and what works for you.
I'm sure a lot of writers who are listening will like that answer. There is no one right way to create your
Nope.
backstory and your story. It's just, I guess, how the story calls to you and how the world calls to you, and then it all sort of fits itself together. But as you say, if you spend a year world
Mhm.
building and you haven't written a sentence, there might be some losses there as far as readers ever getting to explore your world. I really like the way you phrase that. People won't be able to explore your world. That's motivating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Brandy, thank you so much for today. And could you just tell a little bit more about what you do at Fictionary and how Fictionary can help writers explore more about their manuscript's backstory and not info dump?
Yeah, so Fictionary is first and foremost a software created by Christina Stanley, our CEO. I couldn't write without the software. It has all of these elements in it, and it makes you think about them on a story level, but also on a scene by scene basis. And you have to fill out each of the elements at Fictionary. I'm an editor, so you can go there to get editing, to hire an editor that does developmental and structural editing for your stories. Also, I'm an instructor there. They have courses about how to write a book and how to write a series. And there are several instructors. They teach everything from outlining your series and your stories to genre specific things. I teach editing and revising courses because in Fictionary, we see editing and revising as two separate parts of the process. Editing is when you are very observant of what you've written and objective about it, and you don't think of your story as a writer. You think about it as how a reader will experience your story. And then revising is when you actually go back and you make all of the changes to your story based off of what you learned as an editor, editing your story and where the weaknesses are and where the strengths are and filling in all of those holes. And once you know that the story is strong in every single one of the elements, then you can move on to the next levels, which are copy editing, line editing, proofreading, those sorts of things.
And you used Fictionary software, obviously, to write Love and Development.
Yes.
I have to say, having a strong first draft is a very motivating goal because who wants to rewrite their book 4 or 5 times? Well, you can get rid of those first 4 times and make that the first time because you know what you're doing and you know what the story needs. And you can even see step by step where you're missing pieces. And it's really transparent software to work with.
Like I said, I love it and I wouldn't be able to write or edit without it. So Fictionary is definitely something that I recommend to anyone and everyone.
Yeah. I'm going to put the links into the show notes for Fictionary for anybody who's interested to look at what Fictionary does and how it can help you write your book and get a strong first draft. Thank you so much, Brandy, for joining me today to talk about backstory and the dreaded info dump. It's a pleasure to listen to you. You're so interesting and you're great at clarifying things that can be a bit abstract in a writer's mind. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been great to have you again.
Thank you. I love being here and I love talking about story and every aspect of story. So I can't wait until our next episode.
Me too. I'll see you next week.